Get it up. Good job, bud.
Hi, Brett.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Pledge, right? Okay. Please rise for the pledge. Pledge allegiance to the flag. Okay. Okay. Well, good evening. Hi, everyone.
Hello. It looks lonely there in council chambers.
It's very lonely. Nice to see you all there. First item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from our November 23rd meeting. Are there any additions or corrections?
Nope.
Nope.
Do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Seconded.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Minutes are approved. So no lobby visitation. So Brian, you're up.
Okay, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. All right, so the first item on our agenda is a report for the board on our wastewater cost of service and rate study. And for those that haven't seen us before, we hire Courtney and Associates to do our water and our sewer cost of service studies and rate models. They've done it for many years of our past financial analysis. So typically for water and sewer, you'll see Courtney and Associates, and for electric, you'll see Sawville and Associates, and they're both going to be here tonight. But for tonight, I believe John Courtney will be here he's online. He'll be here to present the cost of service study. And then we do have a rate plan that's proposed for the board. We're not asking the board to approve this tonight. And typically when we have a rate study like this, we will present the information to the board and let you look at it, understand it, and then we'll come back at a future meeting and ask you to approve a rate plan for the next couple of years. Just some highlights for what we did in the study. John and his group typically looks at our expenses and our budgets for past years, and then they project those into future years. They look at our future revenue requirements to meet those expenses, and where we are today and where we need to be in 3 or 4 years is how they determine how much of a rate adjustment needs to be made. Typically, we don't project any growth in wastewater sales because it's not necessarily a growth industry. It's not a huge growth generator. And in past years, we've used some inflation increases of around 3%, but this year we asked John to use 2% just based off what we've seen in previous years. We did use the projected 21 budget because of the COVID issues. We didn't expect to see the same COVID issues going forward, so we tried to use our 21 budget for that purpose. And then we did increase the capital spending to $500,000 annually. As you know, we rely heavily on the Water and Sewer Capital Improvement Fund for our capital expenses. And so as we've done in previous years with the water studies and water rates, we've tried to add some funds to our projected expenses on the capital side and the rates or the revenue generation side of the equation, just to try to diversify where those funds are coming from. So now we're not relying so heavily on the income tax fund. I think that was the highlights of what I wanted to cover. John will probably go over those same things again, but if there's no questions, we pull up the presentation. And John, are you able to, can you say something so we can hear you?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. At least in the room we can. So Max will pull up the presentation and share the screen so everybody online and in the room can see it. And John, when you're doing your presentation, if you can just say next slide, please, and Max will, he'll adjust the slides to move those forward. Thank you. Go ahead, John.
That sounds good. Certainly, thank you all for having us join your meeting tonight. It's been, I think, just a little over 4 years since we last took a look at your sewer rates, and as Brian said, you know, we've made a few changes in some of the projections of what we've done in the past, but not anything real major. But let me just start with the next slide, if we could. This gives you kind of the breakdown of the scope of services for the rate study and cost of service analysis. First step is always to kind of go through the data acquisition and verification process. I always have to say, when I do work with Bowling Green, data is not a problem. We're usually able to get all the data we need, and it's always very accurate and very easy to work with. It certainly speaks highly of your staff and their ability to get us what we need for these studies. So once we've gone through the data, then we do what we call a revenue requirement analysis, where we're going to project, you know, what the revenues and expenses are going to be for, you know, the next several years, to determine if there's an adjustment needed. Once we've done that, we take one of the projected years, the long year basically, and perform what's called a cost of service analysis, where we're going to allocate those revenue requirements to each of the customer classes, compare those those allocated costs then to revenues from each of those classes to see if one class or another is subsidizing or being subsidized. Then we take a look at your existing rates and compare those to the cost of service results to see if maybe we need to focus our attention on some portion of those rate schedules with regard to future adjustments, and then we develop those rate adjustments. So with the next slide, the projected revenue requirements kind of breaks into these 4 steps. First, we're going to project your sewer sales, and then we'll project revenues at current rates. Following that, as I said, we'll project the revenue requirements, or as I usually say, what it costs to operate and maintain the wastewater system in Bowling Green. And the last then is to determine the overall revenue adjustment. So if we could go to the next slide. The first step to project the sewer sales is to separate them by class. We do try to normalize historical data. Your sewer sales are based on water consumption, so they are going to fluctuate year to year, basically due to seasonal fluctuations. So we try to kind of normalize that seasonal effect, or weatherize it, I guess you could call it, and then you know, project sales growth rates to the extent we need them. So on the next slide, you'll see the 4 rate classes that we typically break out: the residential, commercial, industrial, and wholesale. What you'll see a little bit later is, as Brian put in his memo, is, you know, a movement to maybe combine the commercial and industrial into one class. But through this study, at least, we've kept them separate. And for all 4 classes, we're assuming 0 growth. We saw very little change, really, from the study from 4 years ago in overall sales or in any, you know, individual class. So, so going forward, we're going to project 0 growth in sales. Next slide. And this gives you those projected sales in 100 of cubic feet CCFs for each of the 4 rate classes. You can see we're projecting in total just shy of 1,300,000 CCF, or 100 cubic feet each year. Next slide, I think, will give you then you know, the revenues at current rates. What we're projecting is basically the overall average revenue for each class. Residential a little over $4, $4.24. Commercial at $3.86. Industrial $2.71, and wholesale at $4.57. So the next slide. There we go. So to project revenues at current rates, we basically are going to apply those average revenues to the usage for each class. And you can see the corresponding revenues there for each of the classes, projecting a total revenue of about $4,719,000. This is within about $20,000 of what we actually, our target revenues were for 2020 in the last rate study. So, so your revenues are actually coming out right on track with what we projected in the last rate study. Next slide. This just gives you kind of a graphical representation of those revenues. This is the revenue distribution by class. You can see residential is the largest of the classes, representing 38% of your revenue. Commercial about 30%, industrial 25%, and then the balance being wholesale at 7%. Now, I need to point out, by the way, as the note says, this excludes your income tax proceeds. As you're probably, I'm sure you're all aware, a portion of your water expenses are actually paid out of income tax, and obviously a portion is paid out of the revenues from rates. So for this portion of the analysis, we're basically just looking at the operating revenues that are derived from the rates. So next slide. So the next step in the process is to project your revenue requirements. I know you've got a long agenda, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on all the breakdown of all the difference between a cash basis versus a utility basis. Suffice it to say, the cash basis is basically what we typically use for municipal rate studies, and that's what we've used for this study. A utility basis basically looks at some non-cash expenses, things like depreciation, excludes things like principal retirement on debt, but then includes a return on investment. So since basically you operate on a cash basis, you need to have enough revenue to meet your cash expenses. We've utilized the cash basis for this study. Like the sales data, we try to normalize the historical financial data. We did take a look at the reviewed the budget for 2020, and actually, because this study ended up later in the year, we actually also used the 2021 budget, which you recently approved. Try to reflect changes in operation, and Brian and Jackie were able to give us some of those that we built into the analysis. Probably the biggest change in the analysis is that we're using a 2% per year inflation, where in previous studies we've been using 3%. So it's one of the changes we made. And then next slide. Obviously, we include the debt service that you have. You'll see that coming up. Transfers out, which basically are for capital improvements. You transfer money out of the operating fund to a reserve fund that basically are spent on capital improvements from operating revenues. Now, that's not to be confused with the income tax monies that also pay for capital outlay. We add up, we have other non-operating expenses. We add all of those expenses up to get to what we call the gross revenue requirement. And then we credit against that things for income credits for things like fees and licenses and permits, some of your special charges for for surcharges, I should say, for heavy discharges. So the next slide gets us to basically the revenue requirements. You can see your operation O&M, roughly a little over $5 million, project out 2024. Debt service, and the key thing here is your debt service, which is a little under $300,000 a year, is actually going to be retired in 2023. And again, this is the debt service paid directly out of your operating fund. And so we are not reflecting that debt service in 2024. The transfers out, you've actually increased. I think the last model we had at about $300,000 a year. One of the things that the staff had asked us was to increase that to $500,000, so that you're funding a little more capital outlay out of your operating revenues. And then again, we've got the income tax or the income credits, that are about $500,000. So gets us to a net revenue requirement in 2024 of about $5.2 million. As I said before, this excludes revenues associated with the income tax proceeds that you get that are used for wastewater. So the next slide. The last step in the revenue requirement analysis is to determine the overall revenue adjustment that's needed to meet revenue requirements. We do that by comparing projected revenue requirements to the projected revenue at current rates. So on the next slide, you'll see what we're showing there for projected revenue at current rates in the first column, getting right at 4.7 million. Revenue requirements actually declining after 2023 down to 5.2 million in 2024. And a revenue adjustment or increase that would be needed to meet those revenue requirements in 2024 of just over 10%. Next slide. So our conclusions and recommendations with regard to the revenue requirement analysis portion of the study are that projected revenues are not sufficient to meet projected 2024 revenue requirements, and that revenues would need to be increased by approximately 3% each year for 2022, 2023, and 2024 in order to meet the projected 2024 revenue requirement. Note that we're not talking about any rate increase in 2021. I think before we go to the next slide, I don't know, Brian, do you want me to take questions as we go, or would you rather just wait till the end?
It's really up to whatever the board would prefer.
Does anyone have questions? Okay.
Okay,
Let's
well,
move
hearing none,
along.
let's go on to the next slide. So the next step is to perform the cost of service analysis, and for purpose of the cost of service analysis, as I said earlier, we're going to use the projected 2024 year. That's kind of the target year that we're looking to adjust revenues to meet. The first step in the process is to basically functionalize those revenue requirements, and we functionalize those into separate functions like treatment and collection, lift stations, customer services, and then billing and collection type costs. So once we functionalize those expenses into those categories, we then allocate them to each of the rate classes based on what was called the base extra capacity method. And this is a methodology recommended by the American Water Works Association, used for both water and wastewater cost of service studies. It's the same method that we've basically been using in prior water and wastewater cost of service studies for the city. We have to develop what we call units of service for each class. And we do that kind of based on each class's contribution to the average flow, the peak daily flow, and the peak hourly flow, because those are different for each class, and obviously we want to capture their contribution to those various units. We also, for customer-related costs and billing collection costs, we do some equivalent number of meters analysis as well. So once we've done all that, we kind of get to the cost of service results and compare it to the revenue at current rates for each class, as we'll see here in a little bit. So let's go to the next slide. Some of these numbers might not make a whole lot of sense to you, but the base cost, which is basically where we've allocated average usage, or allocated based on average usage, the base cost for the system is about $3.18 per 100 cubic feet. Now those extra capacity costs that we talked about, things to meet max day and max hour, end up being $5.50 per 100 cubic feet per day and 82 cents per 100 cubic feet per day. Now those might not make a lot of sense, but those are the numbers that basically get applied to each class's contribution to those max day and max hours in order to allocate them a share of those costs. For the customer cost, we've got meters and services. That worked out to be about $4.72 per equivalent meter per month, and billing collection costs at about $1.95 per bill. So now I should maybe mention here that these costs in the cost of service study now do include the capital costs that are funded from income tax, because they're a part of the overall cost of providing service. We do include those, and as you'll see a little bit later, we also include revenues for each class derived from income taxes. So next slide. The other thing we always take a look at as well is your fixed versus variable cost. And this slide shows you that based on your 2020 budget, anyway, that more than 90% of your costs are basically fixed costs. meaning costs that don't vary or fluctuate based on the amount of water that somebody uses, the amount of sewage they discharge into the sewer. The other 9% is what we call variable costs, and those are costs that do fluctuate based on, you know, the amount of water that has to be, you know, treated at the sewage plant. And those are costs primarily that are related to electricity for pumping as well as chemicals for treatment. And you can imagine that those do vary based on how much flow comes into the plant. But for the most part, labor and capital outlay and most of your operation and maintenance expenses, you know, maintenance of the collection system and lift stations are really not a variable cost. They're a fixed cost. And unfortunately, as Brian pointed out in his memo, your rates actually, you know, are just about the opposite, at least for residential. About 90% of the residential customer bill is variable or based on usage, and only about 10% currently is based on a fixed charge. So, next slide. As I said before, you know, for the cost of service, we include both the operating revenue as well as the income tax revenue. For the study, we've assumed, as you can see in the left side of this graph, we've included income tax revenues of $2.5 million a year, and the operating revenue, as you saw earlier in slides, a little over $4.7 million. So about 2/3 of your revenue for a cost of service study come from operating revenues, and about 1/3 of it comes from income tax. Next slide. So this kind of summarizes the results, comparing the cost of service results to the revenue, again, including income tax proceeds by class. And you can see the breakdown there by each class. We're looking at an overall increase of roughly 10%. And by the way, I do need to make sure everybody understands that column on the right-hand side, the percentages, those percentages are taking the dollar of over or under recovery and dividing it by just the operating revenues, because that's all we really have the ability to adjust is the rates and operating revenues. The income tax is fixed by ordinance, and so when you see that percentage, you won't be able to get that math by dividing by the total revenue over in the first column there. So you can see the residential roughly 3%, they're 3.6%, commercial a little over 12%, industrial are a little over 13%, and wholesale 20.7%. So if we go to the next slide, this just gives you a graphical representation of what the results look like. Oop, I lost the slides. There we go. See if I can get them back. For some reason, they just left me.
John, we can still see the slides on our screen here, and we're on the slide, page 21, the bar graph.
Oh, I got it back. Okay. Yeah, it came back. So the bar graph basically is a graphical representation of the results. The line kind of across the middle of the graph, you can see it represents the overall increase of 10.1%, while each of the bars represents the increase that would be needed for each of the individual classes. Again, residential 3.7%, commercial 12.8%, industrial 13.5%, and wholesale at 20.8%. Next slide. So what's this tell us? Well, again, first off, the cost of service tells us that your fixed costs represent more than 90% of the cost of providing service when you take into account all of the costs of providing service. The cost of service analysis also indicates that the residential class appears to be subsidizing the other classes, and that's evidenced by the fact that, you know, it would need to have a lesser increase than the overall increase, while all the other classes would need to see a greater increase than the overall increase in order to meet cost of service. So arguably, then, future rate adjustments should try to move that revenue distribution towards the cost of service results. And obviously, we would recommend, too, that you would continue to monitor cost of service in the future, which you actually have done typically on about a 4 or 5 year cycle. So, next slide. So I guess before we start the rate review, maybe just see if we've got any questions on the cost of service.
Any questions? Okay.
All All right, well, let's talk about your rates. First step in the process here is to take a look at the existing rates, and then develop rate adjustments to meet those target revenues that we've talked about from the revenue requirement analysis and the cost of service, and then show you some typical bill comparisons, you know, to some other comparable communities around the area. So the next slide. This is your current residential rate. You basically have two components. You have a monthly customer charge of $2 per month, and a usage charge or volume charge, commodity charge, however you want to call it, of $3.80 per 100 cubic feet. Now, those are the inside rates. Those rates took effect at the beginning of this current year. Your outside rates are approximately 40% higher. Sometimes they're a little off because of round off, but they're going to be roughly 40% higher. Next slide. Now, one of the things that you did a couple of studies previously is you developed separate capacity charges based on meter size for your commercial as well as your industrial customers, as you'll see coming up. So I'm not going to run through all these, but you can see that basically you're collecting additional or larger capacity charge based on the customer's ability to draw water, or in this case, discharge sewage. So you have the inside capacity charges again for the normal 5/8 3/4 at $8, and you can see the rest of the charges there. The usage charge then is at $3 per 100 cubic foot, and just like residential, the outside rates are about 40% higher. Next slide. The industrial rates, the capacity charges are the same as the commercial, but you have a slightly lower usage charge, $2.76 versus the $3 for the commercial per inside. And one of the things, as Brian mentioned in his memo, is that the city wanted to kind of move the industrial rates and commercial rates into one rate class, similar to what you do in the water. So as you'll see coming up on the proposed rates, that's what we're going to recommend. Again, the outside rates are for industrial are also 40% higher. So next slide. Now, these are the wholesale rates. A little different capacity charges, kind of carry over from some old rates that you've had, and trying to adjust these. Your usage charge is $4.33 for all 100 cubic feet. This presents a little bit of a challenge when it comes to rate design, as we'll talk about in a minute, because you only have 4 customers, 3 of which are metered, and they have quite a disparity in usage. And so it creates some problems when we start to look at rate design and try not to have one particular customer end up paying or seeing a considerably higher or lower increase than the other customers. So we had to do things a little different, as you'll see on the wholesale rates. So next slide. So for the proposed rate adjustments, in general, what we're recommending, as we talked about in the revenue requirement, is to phase in the rate increase over 3 years, starting in 2022, and roughly increasing those rates by approximately 3% to get to the 10% increase. So it's a little more than 3% when we compound it. So based on the cost of service results, we're recommending that we would increase the residential revenues by 3.6%, commercial by and industrial by roughly 13%, and the wholesale by 20.7%. And again, we're going to combine the commercial and industrial in one class. Next slide. So as we talked about before, because your fixed costs are such a large percentage of your cost of service relative to your variable costs, we're recommending no increase in the usage charge for the residential class, but only putting all the increase then on the monthly customer charge. And what that means is we would have to increase the monthly customer charge from currently $2 to $2.75 in 2024. So basically looking at a 25-cent per month increase in the residential monthly customer charge each year starting in 2022. For the commercial class, we're also recommending no increase in the usage charge and increasing the capacity charges basically as needed to make up, to hit the target revenue. Now, for the industrial class, we're recommending that we increase the usage charge to $3. It's currently $2.76, and we move it up to $3 by 2024. That gets it to the same rate as the commercial rate, usage charge. And the capacity charges, we would increase by the same amount that we're increasing the commercial. So that gets us to basically the same rate structure for both of those by 2024. And then the wholesale, as I said, was a little more of a challenge. We really couldn't really not have some increase in the usage charge given the disparity in the level of usage of those customers. And so we increased the usage charge to $5 and then increased the capacity charges as needed to make up the balance of the 20.7% increase. So I think I've got a slide coming up next, if we could go to that with the rates. Yeah, this would be the existing and proposed retail rates, residential, commercial, industrial, and you can see again on the first line the commercial customer charge going from $2 to $2.75. So just a nominal 25-cent per month increase each phase of the rate increase. The usage charge stays the same, and again, no change in the commercial usage charge. Increasing the industrial usage charge to $3 over the three phases, and then you see the capacity charges that we needed to make up the difference. So, next slide. And this would be the wholesale existing versus proposed wholesale rates. Usage charge increasing from currently $4.33 per 100 cubic feet to $5, and then making up the balance of the increase through the capacity charges over the 3 years. So, next slide. So with that, we've got some typical bill comparisons for you, comparing to your current and the proposed rates to the rates for the current rates for Napoleon, Perrysburg, Fremont, and Findlay. This being the residential bill comparison, which we use 500 cubic feet, which is pretty much right at your average usage for residential, and a 5/8-inch meter. And you can see that your current bill for a residential customer, inside customer, would be $21, and would increase, again, by that 25 cents to $21.75 by 2024. The corresponding rates for the other communities, Napoleon at $65.89, Perrysburg at $40.71, Fremont at $31.69, and Findlay at $26.41. So, arguably, as I have to remind people, your rates don't include all of your costs because about a third of your cost of service is being funded from income tax, but certainly puts you competitive with all of these communities. And by the way, Findlay hasn't raised their rates, as you can see there, since October of 2011. I got to believe before long they'll probably be doing some sort of rate increase. Next slide. Commercial bill comparisons. Again, your current bill for an inside customer using 3,000 cubic feet with a 1-inch meter is $107. That increases to $120.60 in 2024, and you can see the corresponding numbers. And again, other than Findlay, you're below the other three communities anyway. And again, Findlay's rates haven't changed in 9 years. Next slide. Similar with the industrial, your current bill, this would be for a 30,000 cubic foot bill with a 2-inch meter. Your current bill is $878, increases to $990 by 2024. And again, you're below at least the top three. Findlay is under you by a little bit. It's at $676.74. So next slide. So in summary, with regard to the revenue requirement analysis, the projected revenues are not sufficient to meet the near-term revenue requirements, and revenues would need to be increased by approximately 10% in order to meet the projected 2024 revenue requirements. As we said earlier, the cost of service analysis indicates that, if we take into account, the capital expenses that are funded from income tax, the residential class is subsidizing the other rate classes. Next slide. So our recommendation would be to approve the proposed rates, which would move the revenue distribution towards the cost of service results. And again, as you always do, continue to monitor the cost of service analysis and adjust the rates in the future as needed. So I think with that, the next slide would be open for questions.
Anyone have questions?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Yep.
All right, guys. I think we're going to jump off here. We've got another another meeting in a little bit. So
Sure. Thank you. Appreciate your time. Thank you.
thank you.
Also in your packet, I gave you a table on the last page of this item, which has the proposed rates that John just presented. Again, it shows effective dates in 22, 23, and 24. The tables all match up with his numbers. At a point I was going to make, and I lost it. I'm sorry. Anyway, if there's any questions about this, feel free to reach out to me and by email or phone. I'll be happy to answer any questions on this. I would anticipate that in January or early in 21, we would come back to the board and ask you to consider adjusting the rates per the plan that we presented, unless you have questions for us or want to see some other changes implemented. One thing I would say is the board is not required to follow what the cost of service study says. The board has discretion about how rates are established. We've tried to follow these examples in the past, though, because they are based on an industry standard for attributing costs to different rate classes. And there is some logic behind it versus the staff just saying, here's our recommendation on how we would establish these rates. So for the newer members of the board, I'm just trying to give you some history on what's been done in the past and why we do these studies and what the board has considered in past years.
There wouldn't be any rate changes until 2022?
2022, that's correct.
Okay.
And I think if we look at the dates, we did say effective in January of each of those years. We typically have tried to adjust the sewer rates early in the year because the sewer fund is in past has been the one that's been most financially difficult of the funds between electric, water, and wastewater, electric, water, and sewer. The sewer funds are typically the ones that need the most help. And so by applying the rate adjustment in January, we get the full 12 months of adjustments versus waiting until typically for water, we do it in April. Electric has been done in the past in July. So when you do it later in the year, you don't have those few months to collect that revenue. So, but correct, we as we talked about in the budget meeting, we didn't propose any rate adjustment in 21. That's what this reflects as well. So again, no change until January of 22, if the board would approve this at a future meeting. Any other questions from the group? If you are, you're all muted and we can't hear what you're saying. So
No questions from me here.
Yeah, no, I'm good.
I'm good.
thank you very much. Again, reach out to me and give me an email or a phone call and be happy to answer any questions that you may have if they come up in the future.
Thank you, Brian.
Okay, the next item for your consideration is an adjustment to Rider E, which is our renewable parallel generation rate that was added back in October the 12th. The board approved new interconnection standards and a new rider to go with that would compensate customers for generation that they put back onto the system that we metered, but also to add a monthly facilities charge to try to collect revenue that wasn't being collected because the customer put in this behind the meter system. And we still have costs to supply the same level of service to those customers, but because we're not collecting as much revenue because the kilowatt hour sales went down, that was the reason for adding the monthly facilities charge based on the customer's size of their installation. I did intend to get letters out before December, but I was not able to do so. That was my fault. So December the 4th, I did send letters out to the customers that were affected. We had six customers in total. Let them know what the monthly facilities charge was going to be for their particular installation, how much that was going to cost on their monthly bill, the energy credit that they would receive going forward in 21, and then also just let them know there were some new interconnection standards that the board had approved. One of the customers called me shortly after getting a letter and was upset about the monthly facilities charge and just in general that it didn't support carbon emission reductions and thought that the fee should be removed. So in thinking of how we could have handled it differently or how I could have handled it differently, of course, getting a letter out to them in advance would have been a help rather than waiting for 1 month before the charge was going to go on the bill would have been a big help. But given the consideration that the comments that she made, I came up with some suggestions to the board if you wanted to consider them. And the first would be that we delay the monthly facilities charge. We delay billing that until July 1st. And that date corresponds with when our other electric rate adjustments are made. So if you look at our electric rate schedule, everything refers to adjustments on July 1st of each year. And the second change was to implement the monthly facilities charge rate over a 4-year period of time. We typically have done annual adjustments to get a rate to where it needs to be based on a cost of service analysis. In this case, we went ahead with the full $4 per kW charge. So the new rider or the proposed rider would adjust that to add $1 each year. So you'll see in the rider example I gave to you, there's a table at the end of that, and it makes the rate $1 per kW starting in July 1st of 21, and then in 22 it goes to $2, then $3, and then $4 in July 1st of 2024. So that would be a acknowledgement again to the customer that we're going to slowly adjust that rate over a 4-year period of time, give them some advance notice that that rate would change each year to accommodate the increased expense that they're going to see, and hopefully be a little bit easier for existing customers who entered into what's basically a financial arrangement that the rate that the utility charges to them is going to be a little bit different each year. Eventually, the $4 is what we calculated to be what we needed from residential customers. The other rates were also adjusted to go up 25% each year. So you'll see the ones that were meant to be $1, I adjusted those to be 25 cents per year addition. And this would be applied to all existing or new customers, just to keep our billing practices easy. You might say, well, you could have done this for just the existing customers and left all new customers at the full rate because they would then know what that cost would be. But then from a billing perspective, we have to determine and figure out, well, these people are different cases. And so it would be a lot easier for us if we just had one rate that we implemented for the entire year. And then again, in 4 years, we'll be at the rate that we need to be to provide the cost of service or to collect the money that that we spend to provide the service to the customers. The facilities charge will be there again in 4 years so that we're not subsidizing those customers that have rooftop solar, behind the meter solar. And I think that was the most of my points I wanted to cover. I did give you a copy of the letter that I sent back in December so you could see what I relayed to the customers. I gave you a copy of the new proposed rider if the board wanted to consider this. If the board is fine with where we are today, the way the policy stands, you don't have to pass the resolution. You can just say we're good to go and leave it as it is. Otherwise, you can consider the resolution for approval. Be happy to take any questions.
I have a question, Brian. I guess a couple things. One, is there going to be any, or do you have any concerns regarding like billing and then that like escalating that over the 4-year period? Because I think if I recall when we were originally talked about it, there were part of this was, okay, what's the best way that we can make the billing process work? And there were some challenges around that. Do you foresee any issues around having making sure that we call out that escalation each year?
I do not, because on their bill, it's going to show up as, like I said, it's going to identify as a monthly facilities charge, and it's going to be set July 1st of each year, and it would just roll for 12 months. And we have to adjust rates anyways. So for staff to go in and make that one-time adjustment each year, it's just another rate that we have to deal with, but it's really no different than all the other rates that are already on the books to change.
And that would happen in July of each year. Would that be correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I guess just my second question is, you made mention in here that we've actually had another application since then. I guess maybe I would just kind of ask your read on how, I think the point that was made was that, this is a discouragement, I guess, are you getting the impression that from that application that we had gotten that they're discouraged, or that they seemed like they were entering into an unfair deal? Obviously, the existing customers are going to have a slightly different take on it than any new customers. I guess
Sure.
I would just ask for your interpretation of that.
Yeah, I don't think that, I mean, that's obviously the first thing you would think of is, well, you're trying to stop this from happening, and that's not necessarily the case. I try to explain to the customer, our job is, we support renewable energy efforts, but we also have to protect the utility financially so that we can provide the service to customers and make sure that one customer is not being subsidized by another. I don't think we're going to harm the interest of customers to do this. Again, the customer that we just got an application in, the week after last. So this was under the new policy. They filled out the forms and submitted their $250 application fee. They understand the rates that we're going to charge. And in fact, we just got a letter of interest late last week or early this morning. Daryl got that inquiry. And so we've already had another customer calling and asking about our standards and our policy. So I don't think it's going to be a detriment. The cost of rooftop solar continues to go down. So it is an added expense, but when we did use Trey Shepard, who's on the call, to analyze the benefits that the customer gets, and would this extra cost, drive their bill back up to where it was before they put the rooftop solar in? And the answer is no. They still save money. It's just a little bit lower payback for them. Probably a longer, for existing customers especially, probably a longer payback time to get back to paying off the system and getting back what they invested in it. For new customers, again, I think if people have interest in this, they're going to do it anyways. And as prices go down, that will continue to drive the interest in it from our customers. But as the interest goes up, that even more, in my mind, that even more justifies the need for the facilities charge, because that means our revenues go down and we have fixed expenses that we cannot avoid. We have to pay for. And those customers that put in rooftop solar, they demand the same level of service that they had before the rooftop solar went in as to after it went in. Because when their rooftop system or their battery system doesn't function, they still want full access to electric service. And I've got to be ready to serve their load night or day, rain or shine, no matter what. So that's really the reason for the facilities charge. It's not there to try to penalize the customer or say we're not willing to let you do this. If we weren't willing to let them do this, we would just say we're not going to have a policy and you can't do this. But that's not what the policy says.
All right, thank you.
Other questions, thoughts? I'd just say, I think this is what we need to do as far as the rider and having everyone on the same page, and appreciate all the work you've done. But I also, I think this is probably a more fair transition into it for the existing customers. And
Sure.
I think appreciate you kind of rethinking that and bringing this to us.
Yep.
Anything else? Anyone want to make a motion? Do I have a motion?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I move to approve resolution 122020001, approving modifications to Rider E renewable parallel generation.
Second.
Properly moved and seconded. Any other discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Same sign. Approved.
Thank you. Okay, the next item is a discussion of the battery energy storage system. And we have Trey Shepard, who's on the call. I see Trey there now. Trey is going to give you a presentation on the current contract and the financial analysis that we've put together to tell you where we are today. Just at a high level, we've been in negotiations with Veridity for the past several months. We did use Trey Services and John Bentine, who was an attorney in power supply contracts. He had a long history with AMP. Then he retired from AMP, and so we've used him to work for us in this case. Some of the changes that have occurred are the battery system went from 10 megawatts to 12 megawatts, so a slight increase there. Size-wise, it's basically the same layout at the wastewater treatment plant, just north of the Dunbridge substation. The upfront payment did increase a little bit to reflect the larger battery installation from 10 to 12 megawatts. We did get some flexibility on the amount of hours that we could call the battery for peak shaving. And I think the overall, the financial benefits to the city are pretty good in how much we can potentially save for peak shaving. And Trey will go into that in more detail. So let's let Trey take it from here and go ahead and go through the presentation. Trey, can you hear us now? You okay?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to update you on where we stand with the battery. The last time you guys heard from me was probably in June, I think, was when I was there last to update you on where we were. And at that time, you authorized Brian to try to enter negotiations with the preferred supplier. And I think we've gotten to the point now where we have an agreement in hand that we'd like to share with you. And I think the agreement reflects all of the terms and conditions that we were attempting to achieve through the RFP process. And I'll share some of those with you here just so that you can see how they kind of compare to what we thought we were getting and what we're actually getting. And I think we've done a good job of finding a nice balance point where we've achieved our goal at a reasonable price. And I think we've also picked up some additional flexibility that we didn't have before. So I've got a presentation that I'll take you through here quickly. And if you guys have any questions, jump in and let me know what your questions are. But I'll step through as quickly as I can.
Yeah, Trey, we're trying to get it pulled up right now.
Sure.
So when you're ready to advance the slides, again, like John did, just please say next slide.
Sure, absolutely. Perfect. We can head on to the next slide, please. So I'll quickly update you on how we got here, and then I'm going to go through some of the terms and conditions of the agreement itself, and explain to you what the costs are, what the savings are, and kind of what happens next. And again, like I said, if you guys have any questions, feel free to jump in, and I'll try to pause appropriately as I go through in case anybody has any questions that they'd like to bring up. Next slide, please. So we issued an RFP. The goal of the RFP was to acquire a battery that could provide peak shaving services. We're trying to reduce our capacity and transmission costs. We're a price taker in that market, and basically what we can do is we can impact our own electric load at the appropriate time to help reduce what those costs are. We issued the RFP in August of 2019. We got responses back in October of 2019. And then, as I mentioned earlier in June, we presented an update to those responses to the board, and the board found a preferred supplier and authorized Bowling Green, Brian, to begin negotiations for a power supply contract. So that's where we are today. Is we've reached the point of having a contract and an agreement, and we think it's one that reflects all the things we were trying to get. Next slide, please. So this is just a summary of you'll hear me use the acronym ESSA, which is the Energy Storage Services Agreement for the Battery Energy Storage System. Lots of acronyms here today, but ESSA is the agreement that we think is appropriate between Bowling Green and Veridity, who was the preferred supplier. So next slide, please. So in terms of terms and conditions that go along with the agreement, we've got a 15-year term as the base setup. There are early termination clauses and there are some potential extensions to the agreement, but the 15-year term is exactly the same as what we were seeking in the RFP and was what was promised in the RFP. This agreement is now for a 12 megawatt battery. In the RFP, they had indicated they were going to provide 10 megawatts, but as we went through negotiations and as we looked at the site that we had available, basically we found it was mutually beneficial to increase the size of the project up to 12 megawatts. And we think the price reflects that it's mutually beneficial too. So I'll get into that a little bit more as we go through, but it is a slightly larger battery than what we initially thought we were getting in the RFP process. In terms of implementation of the battery, expected to go in service in early or mid 2022. Depends on construction schedule and timing of ordering equipment and approvals and all that stuff, but effectively it should be in place to do what it's intended to do, peak shaving services for us, by 2022. The other thing that we get with the ESSA is a full repowering of the battery in year 9, and that comes at no additional cost. So as just part of the base setup of the agreement, the battery gets basically renewed in year 9 of the 15-year deal. That you can think of it similar to your iPhone, basically. That's what this is. This is a big iPhone battery. If you have the same phone for more than 6 or 7 years, you'll know that your battery power isn't as good as it used to be. So part of what we get with this deal is in year 9, as the battery has degraded over time, they're going to fully repower it for us. And it'll be like new for the last couple of years of the deal. And then again, similar to what we saw in the RFP, we offered the existing substation site that we have, and they're going to locate it there, kind of the same way they proposed it in the RFP. So next slide, please. In terms of the cost associated with the ESSA, what we've negotiated is an upfront payment of $2.435 million from Bowling Green to Veridity. That payment actually comes out in 2 installments. So the first payment is made within 10 days of submission of a construction schedule. That's likely to be in 2021. And then the second payment occurs within 30 days of the battery entering commercial operation, which is likely to be 2022. I guess it is possible that the battery is completed by the end of 2021, but we are expecting that to be 2022. So although I say upfront payment, basically what I'm saying is we're paying as this thing goes into service initially, and we do pay a portion of it as construction's ongoing, and then we pay the last piece of it when construction is finished. Comparing that to the RFP, when we looked at the RFP, the initial option we got from Veridity, which was the preferred supplier, was to pay $240,000 a year over 15 years. So that's the same as paying $3.6 million. So what the upfront payment option allowed us to achieve was effectively a $1.2 million savings of the cost disbursement by BGMU to acquire the battery. And we're getting a larger battery than we thought. So the $3.6 million, if we were talking about a 12 megawatt project in the RFP instead of a 10, probably would have been a larger number. So although the upfront payment requires you to have the funds, which you do have, it does require you to have them. It does present quite a bit of cost savings over the term of the deal. So the upfront payment number you see there, and then the only other thing that Bowling Green pays is the operating costs for the battery, and that number can change each year. We're estimating it'll be about $20,000 a year. Depends on what you do with battery operation, and I'll talk about some of the more terms and conditions as we go. But you have some flexibility on how you're going to call on the battery to be used on your behalf. But this cost is just market energy used to charge the battery and discharge the battery when you guys are going to use it. When you're not using it, those costs, those market costs, are all the responsibility of Veridity. So you'll see in the tables that number can fluctuate, but if you think $20,000, that's going to be a pretty close representation of what you're going to pay each year after you make your initial upfront payment. One of the really important keys of the ESSA is that the agreement includes investment protection for Bowling Green. So obviously, when we're making a large cash disbursement upfront like this to acquire the services for this battery, we want to make sure the battery is going to operate and do what we want it to. And if it doesn't, we want to make sure our money doesn't go to waste. So there's all kinds of investment protection here. If the battery does not operate the way it's supposed to, there's some guarantees that come along with it. If the services aren't provided, we get our money back plus some extra benefits. And if something were to happen to Veridity, again, we have investment protection. They have to acquire a surety bond, meaning that they will have enough money reserved to give us our money back plus a little extra in case something happens. So obviously, an initial indication would be, well, should we really pay this money up front for a 15-year deal and just hope they uphold their end of the bargain? The agreement has protection in it that if they don't, we get our money back. So it's a nice term that we got put, or a nice condition we got put in the agreement to make sure that we're protected there. Next slide, please. So the savings that we're expecting to achieve to offset the costs that I just went through are capacity and transmission cost reductions. So the forecast would indicate that we expect to receive about $500,000 to $600,000 a year in capacity and transmission cost reductions. When we did the RFP analysis, that number was more like $300,000 to $400,000 a year. So acquiring a larger battery and negotiating some favorable cost terms in the agreement have upped the amount of annual savings that we expect to achieve. So getting $500,000 to $600,000 a year in cost reductions is the equivalent to about 1% of annual electric system revenues. So we should expect to see our costs reduced by 1% a year. And then some of the other really important parts of getting these savings is there's a performance guarantee on the battery. So if the battery doesn't perform to the level that they've promised us and guaranteed us, whether it completely fails or whether it underperforms, we get the guaranteed savings under the right conditions. So if we do what we're supposed to do and uphold on our end of the deal, we're basically guaranteed to get the $500,000 to $600,000 a year. The other thing that comes along with this is the output of the battery, the power that the battery generates, is guaranteed for all 15 years. It does decline over time to coincide with the degradation on the battery. But as I mentioned, they fully repower it in year 9. So the battery power guarantee is reflective of what the battery is expected to do for all 15 years. Another thing we got in the agreement was a contribution from Veridity towards our administrative costs. It's about $8,300 a year, and that's because the way the billing is going to work and the way the battery is interconnected to the system, there's some coordination that goes on between Bowling Green and Veridity and AMP, and just to make sure that Bowling Green's not bearing all the costs, the extra costs of administration and billing and things of that nature, Veridity is offered to make a contribution of $8,300 towards that. And then the last part of the savings is if the battery overperforms, which it's possible that it does, that potential does exist, the savings would be increased. So if we were guaranteed the $500,000 to $600,000 a year, and if things go really well and the battery overperforms what we think it's going to do, there's an opportunity for even more savings than what you see here. Next slide, please. I'll go through this one and then I'm going to kind of pause for a second and give you guys a chance to ask me any questions that you have. So in terms of the operation of the battery, we're allowed 120 hours of peak event calls. Those peak event calls will be made to try to predict when those capacity and transmission peaks occur so that we're offsetting our load during those times. In the RFP, that was probably closer to 90 hours. We were allowed 30 events for 3 hours each. So we got some additional hours of peak event calls, and our events can be called for 2, 3, or 4 hours instead of just 3 hours. So we got some additional flexibility there as well. And then what they guarantee out of the battery does adjust proportionately with whether we make a 2, 3, or 4 hour call. So we have some opportunities there to kind of balance our own risk reward. If we make a 2 hour call, we get more out of the battery than if we make a 4 hour call. And so if we're getting more out of the battery, our savings would reflect larger amounts than if we made a 4 hour call. And then consistent with the RFP, Veridity is still the owner and operator of the battery. They'll just operate it on our behalf when we make those calls. And then we have AMP that will help us determine when those peak events are going to happen and help us with the energy cost billing and administration. So before I jump into the analysis or anything like that, does anybody have any questions about cost or savings or operations or any of that stuff?
Just one quick question, Trey. If we were to come up, say, significantly short of that 120 hours annually, which I don't know how likely that is necessarily, but if we were, there's no rolling any of that forward for our availability, right? It's just 120 on a calendar year. Would that be correct?
Correct. Yep. You get 120 hours each year. And basically what will happen is since the cost of energy is expected to be, I mentioned earlier, it's about $20,000 a year to charge the battery up to be able to use it for those 120 hours. And the savings are about $500,000 to $600,000 in value. We will likely use all 120 hours each year just to make sure that we've secured the savings. But if we don't use them, they don't roll forward, but we also don't pay the same amount to use the energy. So the $20,000 would go down a little bit. But as I mentioned, we're probably going to use almost all of those 120 hours just to do our best to lock up that savings.
All right, I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anything else? Okay, let's talk about analysis a little bit. What you're going to see in the next couple of slides is 3 scenarios. So this first scenario is based on making a 2 hour call for the battery 60 times. So since we get 120 hours of events, if you make a 2 hour call, you can do it 60 times. If you make a 3 hour call, you can do it 40 times. Make a 4 hour call, you do it 30 times. And what you'll see is the amount of net cost and savings that occur each year. They're greater if you make a shorter call because you get more out of the battery, but there's always savings. So you're going to see savings for all the scenarios. And basically, your actual results won't match up with any of these tables. They'll fall in the range of these tables. So 2 hours, if you think of it this way, this table is going to show you the best you could expect to do. And then the last table is going to show you probably the worst you could expect to do, where the second table will be kind of the average or expected results. But the nice part about this agreement is your staff is going to have the ability to balance the amount of risk reward they want to take to acquire these savings. And at this point, working with AMP, which we've done for a number of years on forecasting when these peak events occur, we've gotten pretty efficient at it, and there's usually plenty of notice when they're going to happen. And so we can probably be a little aggressive on trying to target these savings. So I'll go through the tables and just show you where the dollars fall, and then give you a chance to ask me any questions or see if there's something I haven't covered. So for this individual table here, if you make a 2 hour call on the battery 60 times throughout the year, the first couple of columns that have the negatives are your costs. So there's 2 cost components. It'd be your lump sum payment of the $2.435 million, and then the ongoing annual expenses to operate the battery. And then to offset those costs, you would see savings or revenues. There's two savings categories, and then there's one revenue category. So the transmission savings or the capacity savings are both the numbers that you get from the peak shaving events. And those numbers, if you made calls consistent with what this table is referring, these 2-hour calls, those numbers would be guaranteed, basically. It's reflective of what they've promised us the battery can do, and it's matched up with a forecast on what the transmission and capacity prices will be. If the transmission and capacity prices are different, the number will change, but you will still see savings consistent with what the battery output is expected to be. So you've got, in this table, you've got your two cost components, you've got your three savings or revenue components, and over the term of the deal, of this 15-year deal, shows a total net cost savings of 8.66 million, excuse me, over the 16 years. And the reason you see 16 years is due to the nature of capacity and transmission costs. There is a lag that occurs. So by year one, you see it's all dollars, it's all cost, because basically you pay for the battery and you pay to operate the battery in year one, and due to the lag, when you get the benefits back, those show up in year two. So you'll see as you go down the table that it's all cost in year one, and then you get revenues in the following subsequent years. And if you look at year 10, kind of midway through the table, what you should notice is that the savings numbers jump up from what they were the couple of years prior to that. That's consistent with the repowering of the battery in year 9, and then the lag in the results showing up on the savings in year 10. Trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to point out about this one before we move on. I think that's it on the 2-hour call. Let's go to the next one. 8.7 million is a number to keep in the back of your mind if you make a two-hour call. Everything here is basically the same, with the exception of, so you make the same lump sum payment, whether you're making a 2-hour call, 3-hour call, or 4-hour call. So it's still the same cost on the lump sum payment. The market energy cost would be a little bit less that you see here. That's just because you're going to ask for the battery to operate fewer times. So there's less charge and discharge energy to pay for. And then on the saving side of things, the savings are a little bit less, because if you make a 3-hour call on a 12 megawatt battery, you should only expect to get 4 megawatts out of it. Instead of making a 2-hour call on a 12 megawatt battery, you'd get 6 megawatts out of it each hour. So that's why you'll see at the bottom of this table, the overall net cost savings is about 5.15 million. When we did the RFP and we were looking at a 10 megawatt battery and trying to select the right supplier, when we looked at Veridity, the number we got over the 15 years from them is pretty much exactly the same as what you see here. So although we've made some changes to the size of the battery and some of the terms and conditions in the agreement, we basically, in our 3-hour call, which is our base scenario, get to the same exact point as what we thought we were going to get to when we evaluated it in the RFP. Lastly, I'll show you one more table. Going to look exactly the same. So next slide, please. This one has the same lump sum payment, slightly different cost, slightly different savings, because this would be making a 4-hour call on a 12 megawatt battery. So you'd get 3 megawatts each hour out of the battery. And so the overall net savings are down to 3.2 million. The 4-hour call is the most conservative, is what I'll call it, call, where you would basically be guaranteed to hit all of the peaks. And so this, making a 4-hour call would mean it's pretty easy to predict and hit the peaks all the time. The savings aren't as great as they're on the other calls, but that's why you have some flexibility and some leeway on figuring out exactly what makes sense for making those calls. And as I mentioned earlier, AMP's gotten pretty efficient at identifying when those windows occur, and we can really narrow down to make sure that our call matches up with the window and that we lock in the savings that we're looking to get. So one more slide on analysis. If you go to the next one, please. Just a graphical representation of the expected annual savings from the battery for the various scenarios. The blue line is representative of what happens if you make all 2-hour calls, where the green line at the bottom is what happens if you make all 4-hour calls. So as I mentioned earlier, you would expect your results to fall between green and blue, and probably more likely between red and blue because of the forecasting methodology and the efficiency of it, excuse me, has gotten us to the point where 2 and 3-hour calls are probably the most likely thing that we'll do. And then you see the bump up in year 8 and 9, from year 8 to year 9, consistent with the battery repowering. So this graph is showing the 15-year savings that would be expected in like years 2 through 16 of the deal after you make the payment. So if you're wondering why it's 9 in one and 10 in the other, it's just shifted to show the 15 years when we would be getting the benefits out of the battery. So you can see there, it's pretty reasonable to expect somewhere between $500,000 and $600,000 of annual savings, which is something that I mentioned earlier, and that's about 1% of your electric system revenue. So if you go to the next slide, please. The conclusions from where we've gotten to here with the agreement is that the ESSA includes the key terms and conditions from the RFP process that we were trying to achieve. And effectively, we've gotten capacity and transmission savings at a reasonable cost. Those capacity and transmission savings are about $500,000 to $600,000 a year, which is slightly greater than what we thought we were getting from the RFP. It's consistent with about 1% of your electric system revenue, and consistent with the RFP. And kind of importantly, there's performance guarantees where those numbers are kind of locked in for us. We're going to get them as long as we uphold our end of the deal, and our investments protected in terms of any bankruptcies or underperformance or lack of service if they don't provide the service that they've promised to provide. So pretty much everything we wanted is included, and we picked up some additional flexibility and made some reasonable consideration to cost to make sure that we've locked in the savings that we thought we were getting, and actually even a little bit more. So one final slide is the next steps. We need to sign the ESSA. There's also an interconnection agreement that comes along with the ESSA for validity to interconnect to your system. We have to get through our PJM interconnection approvals. We don't expect any issues there, but it can take some time, and you got to go through the process with them. And then lastly, we'd have the project deployment and construction. And as I mentioned, we expect this thing to be up and running sometime in early to mid 2022. So with that, I will take any questions that you have. Let me know if there's something that I didn't explain or didn't explain well enough. We'll try to go back through it.
Any questions?
I do have one question, and I don't know if this is more Trey or more you, Brian, but thank you, Trey. I appreciated the detail. This is awesome. I guess my question is, do we have any plans maybe to review those call times and how we perform on those in the first, early on? Just looking at the payback period on it, I think on the 2-hour call, it was like somewhere in that 5th year. If I did my math right, I think on the 3-hour call, it's closer to like the 8th year. I didn't move quick enough to get the 4-hour, but I'm sure it was 10 years plus. Do we have plans or a program ready to go as far as just kind of evaluating where we are on those calls?
Yeah, so AMP for many years has, I'll get to where I think is the answer to your question, but AMP has for many years sent out emails and warnings about upcoming peak shaving days or peak days for the membership to be concerned about, and to try to get information to our customers. And we try not to cry wolf too many times in a year, because customers tend to just kind of ignore them after so many times. So we try to pick the worst case ones, and they color code them, black, red, orange, yellow, and you want to make sure you hit the worst of the bunch. And so we know those when those days are going to occur at least a day in advance. And so that's what we'll probably be using to make the determination on how to make those calls. And I would say that the responsibility for making the call is going to come down to my office, and how we which ones we want to do or not do. So I think what we would do is we would update the board as the contract went on. We made so many calls, or as the PJM capacity days, the 5 peak shaving days we would look for, and the 1 peak shaving day we would look for on the transmission side. We will know those at some point throughout the summer, but you don't know those until they've occurred. And so as PJM or First Energy sets those peaks, they may make a new peak in August or September. They would replace a peak from July. And so when we did the first requests for proposals, we had basically asked for 30 events, assuming we were going to make 3-hour calls. This new contract, a new agreement, allows for 120 hours. So we think we'd actually get more events we would be able to call for. So it's really going to come down to how well do myself and my staff predict when those events are going to occur. And we will know at the end of the summertime whether we were successful or not. And we will know what those projected savings are going to be for the next year. And I would have no problem with coming back to the board and reporting at the end of the summer when the five CP events have occurred and when the 1 CP event has occurred, and how much did we peak shave on those days and what those estimated savings would be for the next calendar year. So does that answer your question, Andy?
Yeah, absolutely. I just more wanted to make sure we had a plan than anything else, and I was sure that we did, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
Certainly.
Maybe one other thing that I'll toss in here, Brian, is AMP's already doing this on a number of other projects. So there are other peak shaving generators that are located around the AMP footprint, and even in Bowling Green, there are some power secure units located out by the wastewater treatment plant near to where the battery is going to be. And those types of generators are intended to do the exact same thing. So they're targeting the same events. And so AMP has already operated its forecasting department and its generation fleet in a manner to try to hit these peaks before for a number of years. The only difference in this case is we're talking about a battery, which actually has even faster response time than the generators that they're operating. So having 120 hours, I don't have the statistics on it, but the number of peak events that they typically call for is significantly less than 120 hours a year. So going from 90 to 120, we thought we definitely covered our risk component there to make sure we have enough hours of operation. That's obviously, that could change over the next 15 years. We don't know exactly what's going to happen with loads and forecasts and what might happen with customer load shifts in PJM and things of that nature. But I guess I would point out the other thing is, I didn't go through this in the agreement, but we do actually have the right to call on it more than the 120 hours. So if something happened and we were concerned that we were going to miss a peak due to the nature of the significant value that comes along with having to hit 5 or 6 events a year, we do have the right to pay some extra dollars to get some extra hours. So we do have the ability and the flexibility to make sure that we do hit those savings points. It just might come at a slightly different cost than what you see here. And so I think I mentioned, the annual operating cost of about $20,000 a year. We could increase that number with some additional calls in order to secure the $500,000 to $600,000. So we really do have the option to protect our investment there. And it's more about just making sure that the methods that we're using to forecast those peaks are reflective of the current conditions. And that's something that AMP's always monitoring, because they have a lot of things that they're operating to make sure that they just don't miss them. They can't afford to for all of their members, Bowling Green included.
Yeah, so in your packet, along with the presentation and Trey's letter analysis that kind of outlines what he just went through, I did include a copy of the current contract, and I would say that it's pretty well defined at this point. While it does say draft, I would say all the major sticking points that were either on our side or on Veridity side have been worked out. There's also that's a fairly lengthy document, but there's also an interconnection agreement as a draft as well. And there's some things to work out in that agreement. But overall, it's a pretty standard format. We don't expect any major changes to that document. We did not include the upfront payment in the 21 budget because at the time when the budget was prepared, we didn't really know what the number was going to be. The contract negotiations were ongoing, and that number was fluid yet because we hadn't gotten the degradation curve from Veridity. And so I didn't feel comfortable with putting in a large request, not knowing if that was the right amount or not, and knowing that I could always come back to the board and ask for a supplemental appropriation. So the amount that we're asking for, and it's included in some in the write-up and also in the resolution that you have, is 2.45 million. I rounded it up from what what Trey referred to earlier at 2.435 million. But basically, we would transfer that from cash reserve funds to enterprise, and then transfer that from the capital reserve fund into the 86,000 equipment line to make that payment. And this is a really a very effective way to utilize our cash reserves. We've tried to look at ways we can lower power supply costs by using our cash reserves. And as Trey mentioned earlier, AMP does peak shaving through Power Secure, which is a company that sells diesel engines, and they sell those to AMP membership and other people for peak shaving events or for backup purposes. So a couple of years ago, the board and city council approved purchasing a Power Secure diesel generator that sits very close to this location at the substation, and we used cash reserves for that purpose to do peak shaving events, just as Trey described to you earlier. So in this case, we're looking to use cash reserves to make this payment for this battery, and this is going to directly affect our power supply costs. We can't use cash reserves to pay power supply costs, but we can use cash reserves to make assets or lease payments like this, which will help to lower power supply costs. This is a way to use cash reserves to benefit the customers and lower customer expenses. So we look at this as a really good option in ways to try to do peak shaving to lower expenses, get not necessarily get revenue, but get an indirect benefit by the expense reduction side of the coin. We did have a question for the auditor, whether or not cash reserves could be used for that purpose. We got some feedback today that indicates that yes, we can. We have one or two more questions that we've sent to them just to verify that this is exactly what we want to do. Does the auditor agree this is an acceptable practice? So while it may pass the attorneys and Trey's and my and Daryl's review, it really comes down to what will the auditor and the accountants accept. So we think we're covered. I don't anticipate any changes, but again, the important thing here is leveraging our cash reserves to try to lower power supply costs, and that was really what we were trying to target from the very beginning, and it looks like we're going to be able to do that. I think that covers most of what I wanted to talk about. That's not covered in isn't covered in the write-up. Again, the resolution just asks for the board's concurrence in this current contract that we've presented, the interconnection agreement, which is also presented. It also covers the supplemental appropriation. City Council did approve an ordinance which authorized me to sign a contract. We did say we'd come back to the board and update you as the negotiations were ongoing. We think we're pretty much there now. So I don't think that City Council would have to authorize signing the contract because that was already done before. However, they do have to authorize the supplemental appropriation of the funds that were not included in the 21 budget. So there will still be a oversight or review by City Council to approve those funds to be spent.
Any questions? Do I have a motion?
Madam Chair, I have a motion to approve Resolution 12-20-2002, authorizing the Utilities Director to execute a contract with Verity Energy Systems, Inc. for a battery energy storage system and an interconnection agreement and authorizing a supplemental appropriation.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Approved. Thanks, Brian.
Okay, thank you. The next item, Trey, thank you very much. I'm not sure if
Yes,
it looks like you're
thank
still there,
you.
but I appreciate your time, Trey.
Sure, thanks, guys.
Okay, the next item is a request to advertise, a request to advertise for a request for qualifications. Odd way to say that, but this is for work that we want to do on West Wooster Street. This includes water and sewer upgrades and improvements. This mainly is really trying to get ahead of the paving project that is scheduled for 2022. I gave you a general overview or a map showing you the area, but it's West Wooster Street from Church Street over to Haskins Road and then up Haskins Road to about Wallace. It's about 3,300 feet total project length. We did hire Pogemeyer Design Group several months ago to do a water distribution model, and that was really not necessary for this particular project, but just to look at the system overall. And this is one of the areas we actually asked them to look at, what pipe size would we need to serve this area and pass water down Wooster Street, get to downtown. They determined that a 12-inch water main would be adequate. But we would be looking to do valves, hydrants, and water service lines on Wooster Street as well. There's also multiple sewers that's on West Wooster Street, and I'm not sure how they years ago put the system together, but sewers are running opposite of each other in some blocks. It's a little strange, but that's what we have today. So we would like to get that down to one sewer to serve the whole area, and also set ourselves up that in a future year we can eliminate some backyard sewers that the city has that runs north of Wooster Street and cuts through people's properties. And if those ever failed, I'm not really sure how we would ever get to those. But doing some work now could set us up for eliminating those backyard sewers in the future. Obviously, manholes and catch basins and sewer laterals would also be reviewed as part of that project. We did include $2.2 million in the Water and Sewer Capital Improvement Fund. We do expect that this project scope is too large to do in-house. Anytime you get above about $1 million in total project costs, that's getting a little bit too large for us to do it in-house with the staff that we have. So we're looking to go outside for this, which is why we're requesting for qualifications. Just using a straight percentage of the 2.2 million, that's how I got $275,000 for engineering fees for the water and sewer work. We'd like to move forward relatively quickly because we do need to get, this is a large scope. We have some things to figure out before we can actually go into construction. And we have to make sure that we're going to be completed in time for the paving project to be done in 22. So I did give you a resolution for this. I said in an aerial map. We're not anticipating a loan for this project. This would just be using cash on hand or revenues that would be generated from the Water and Sewer Capital Improvement Fund to pay for this project.
Any questions? Do I have a motion?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
move to approve resolution 12202003, authorizing the utilities director to advertise a request for qualifications and enter into a contracts for engineering services for the West Wooster Street water and sewer improvements.
Second.
I'll second.
Properly moved and seconded. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. We are approved.
All right, thank you. And the last item is, again, another request for qualifications for an engineering project This would be for some water main replacements in the village subdivision. We're also asking for approval for an EPA or OWDA loan, which we've used in the past for large capital expenses. So in the village, this is the area that's between Brim Road and the high school, just north of Poe Road, built several decades ago. And the pipe out there is cast iron pipe, but the soils that are in the area are obviously corrosive soils. And we see this from time to time in different locations of the city, or we have water pipe where the soil actually corrodes and degrades the water main or hydrants or valves, those types of things. So during some recent hydrant operations and flushing, we did experience several breaks in the area. And as typically you can have those breaks occur if the valve, the hydrant is opened too quickly or closed too quickly. That can cause breaks, but our staff is very well trained and not opening or closing those too quickly, because they understand that can happen, and nobody wants to be repairing water mains. But during the repairs, they did note that the poor quality, poor condition of the water main that's out there today, and that's why this led to being included in the budget for next year. Our plan right now is that we believe all the water mains are compromised or of poor condition, poor quality, and so our suggestion and recommendation is to replace all of the water mains in this subdivision, because they were all installed about the same time. They all have a break history that we've been out to repair many locations around the subdivision. In all, it's about 6,000 feet of water main. There is a 12-inch line on Revere Drive and Jefferson Drive, which would likely have to be replaced with a 12-inch. The other streets have a 6-inch pipe, but those would be upgraded to 8-inch, which is our minimum standards for today. We would look at water valves as well, and possibly the hydrants and service lines like we would do on Wooster Street. I did give you an aerial map to show you where the area is located. Again, size and scope of this project being around 1.6 million. That's our current estimate. Again, too large to really do in-house. We'd be looking to do outside engineering for this project. These numbers are very rough, and so as we develop more details on what the full scope is going to be for replacements, I will update the board on both projects, frankly, Wooster Street and the village subdivision, if project costs change, or if we need to rethink our priorities for other projects that are in the Water and Sewer Capital Improvement Fund. Again, we did anticipate an EPA or OWDA loan, and OWDA is the Ohio Water Development Authority. Those two agencies collaborate together to offer low interest loans for projects like this. We've also used these loans for projects at our water plant. And if you go back to the budget book, you'll see our debt service payments that are made out of the Water and Sewer Capital Improvement Fund. Typically, those loans are the same type of a loan through EPA or OWDA. So it's a pretty standard process that we're familiar with in filling out the nominations and the applications for these loans. There's two resolutions that I've prepared. The first is for the engineering services for the work, and the second would be for the EPA OWDA loan application.
Any questions or discussion or motion?
Madam Chair.
Madam Chair.
Have at it, Brett.
Go ahead.
It's all
Madam
yours.
Chair,
Yes.
I recommend that we approve Resolution 12, 2020-04, authorizing the Utilities Director to advertise a request for qualifications and enter into a contract for engineering services for the village subdivision water main improvements.
Second.
Properly moved and seconded. Any discussion? All in favor? Aye. Opposed, same sign. Approved.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Move to approve Resolution 122002, let me start that over. 12202005, authorizing the Utilities Director to apply for a loan and execute an agreement with the Ohio EPA, Ohio Water Development Authority for water supply revolving loan account, funding for the design and construction of the village subdivision water main improvements.
I second the motion.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, same sign. Is approved.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that very much. The only other update I have for the board is this past Friday, we had an Ohio EPA audit of our asset management program, and that required myself and Jackie Spangenberg and Michelle, Mike Fields, Mike Johnson, Brad Holman. I got everybody in that. But we met with online with EPA staff, and they reviewed our asset management program. I'm sorry, Jason Heyman, he's our GIS coordinator. And we passed without problem. It all went very well. That's required to be done every 3 years if you have an EPA loan. Our last review was 3 years ago. So in order to get the loan for the water treatment plant low service pump station upgrade, they had to do another asset management audit. And so they look at all kinds of things. They look at our water rates. You know, did we talk about it with the board, and how do we put those together? They look at our GIS. How are we tracking our assets? How are we making sure that our financials are all in place? And so it covers a wide range of information that requires the expertise and input from everybody that I listed in that group. A lot of time spent trying to put all the information together, and for staff to get that information for the EPA. If you don't meet all the criteria, you get a notice of violation that you haven't met the requirements per the state law, and then you have to go back and fix it, and then show them how you fixed it. So I'm happy to report that that went smoothly. There was no violation, and it's all good. So
Thank you all.
yeah, that's all I have.
Any questions?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Any official reports, Mr. Mayor?
I have no report, and neither does Lori, who's watching from home.
Council member reports?
No report.
Okay. Board member reports? Any other business? Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
I'll second that.
Second.
Favor?
Aye.
Aye.
We're adjourned. Nice seeing you all.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.